unfold.
All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're cracking open a cold case that's over 3,000 years old. But this isn't about just one murder. No, this is about the death of an entire world, a whole network of civilizations that died all at the same time. We're going to run the autopsy on the year 1177 BC. This right here is our black box recording. It's the last desperate message ever sent from the magnificent port city of Ugarit. I want you to just imagine a scribe, his hands shaking, his city literally burning around him, carving this final plea into a clay tablet. It is a voice frozen in a moment of pure terror, and it's our first clue. So, let's officially open the case file. What we're looking at is the sudden, violent, and frankly mysterious collapse of all the great powers in the Eastern Mediterranean. We're talking about a single generation where mighty empires just vanished. Trade routes dried up, entire systems of writing were forgotten. The big question is, what killed the Bronze Age? Now, to understand the crime, you first have to understand the victim. And let me be clear, this wasn't some primitive backwater society. No way. This was a complex, sophisticated, deeply interconnected world that honestly seemed too big to fail. Think of it like a G8 for the ancient world. You had the big dogs, New Kingdom Egypt, the Hittite military machine, the seafaring Mycenaeans in Greece, and the Copper Kings over on Cyprus. And these guys weren't strangers, you know? They were a club. They made treaties, they traded, they married off their kids to each other, they called each other brother in their letters. It was a truly globalized world. So what was the engine driving this whole civilization? It was one single technology, bronze. Bronze was the plastic, the steel, and the silicon of its day, all rolled into one. If you controlled the ingredients for bronze, you controlled everything. And that made its supply chain both their greatest strength and their biggest weakness. And here is the absolute crux of the problem. One of those ingredients, tin, was incredibly hard to find. So let's say you're trying to make a sword in Greece. You can get the copper from nearby Cyprus, no problem. But the tin? That might have to travel 3,000 miles, all the way from mines in modern-day Afghanistan. This created a huge strategic dependency, kind of like our reliance on oil or semiconductors today. You cut that supply line, and the whole system just seizes up. And if you want proof of just how globalized they were, look at this. This is the cargo list from just one shipwreck found off the coast of Turkey. It's just incredible. 10 tons of copper from Cyprus, a ton of tin from Central Asia, glass from Egypt, ebony from deep in Africa, even amber that came all the way from the Baltic Sea. This isn't just a ship. It's a floating time capsule of the world economy. Now get this. The copper and tin on that one boat was enough to make weapons and armor for an army of 300 soldiers. So we're not talking about some guy selling trinkets at the market. This was a state-level strategic shipment of military-grade stuff. This world was rich, it was complex, and it was tied together by threads stretching for thousands of miles. So what on earth could bring a world like that to its knees? Okay, let's get to the investigation. It's time to line up the suspects. And our prime suspect, the one caught standing over the body, so to speak, is a mysterious group called the Sea Peoples. Egyptian records tell a pretty terrifying story. They describe this confederation of invaders just sweeping in from the sea and the north, leaving a path of pure destruction. A carving from Pharaoh Ramesses III says it all. No land could stand before their arms. The Hittite Empire? Gone. The great cities of Syria? Burned to the ground. And they were all headed for the last man standing, Egypt. So who were these people? Well, thanks to modern forensics, we can actually start to put some faces to the names. DNA evidence has confirmed that the Philisettes, who you might know as the biblical Philistines, came from the Aegean, from Greece. The Shurden, those guys with the cool horned helmets, have been linked to Sardinia. It seems like many of them were displaced Greeks, refugees fleeing the collapse of their own civilization. But here's the clue that changes everything. If you look closely at the Egyptian carvings, you see something strange. These Sea Peoples aren't just warriors. They're traveling with their entire families, women, children, all their belongings piled high on ox carts. Now, you don't bring your kids to an invasion, unless you have no home to go back to. This wasn't just a raid. It was a mass migration of desperate, homeless people. So how did a bunch of refugees manage to topple the greatest armies in the world? Well, they had a deadly tech advantage. See, the big empires used these long, brittle swords that were basically just for thrusting, like a rapier. The Sea Peoples showed up with something new, the No-Way-2 sword. It was a beast. You could cut, you could thrust, and its hilt was almost impossible to break. In the chaos of close-quarters combat, it was a total game-changer. So there we have it. The Sea Peoples did it. Case closed, right? Well, not so fast. The more you look at the evidence, the more the Sea Peoples look less like the cause and more like a symptom. Which leads us to the big question. Were they acting alone? Because it looks like they had some hidden accomplices. Let me introduce you to the silent killer. This chart shows ancient pollen data dug up from the ground. And what it shows is that right around 1200 BC, there was a sudden, catastrophic shift in the climate. The pollen from trees just plummets, and it's replaced by pollen from dry, scrubby plants. This wasn't a bad summer, folks. This was the start of a megadrought that went on for almost 300 years. And that drought, it gives us the motive for everything that happened next. We don't just have to rely on pollen. We have their letters, their panicked messages. The archives of the Hittite Empire are full of kings just begging for food. This quote from a Hittite king trying to get grain says it all. It is a matter of life and death. Famine was strangling these great empires, pushing whole populations to the edge of survival. So it's time to bring all the evidence together for the final verdict. What we have is a perfect storm. We've got desperate people on the move with new weapons, crashing into a world that was already crippled by famine and probably a series of major earthquakes. No single one of these things would have been enough, but together, it was a kill shot. The verdict is death by systemic collapse. It was a domino effect. First, the climate shock hits, boom, you get famine. That famine forces people to migrate, boom, you get the Sea Peoples. Their raids disrupt all the trade routes, boom, the tin supply gets cut and you can't make weapons anymore. Then the people back home who are starving and unprotected revolt against their kings, boom, internal collapse. And finally, the whole interconnected system just dissolves. So the final autopsy report would read something like this. The Bronze Age wasn't murdered. It died of multiple organ failure. Its own complexity, its own interconnectedness is what made it so fragile. The drought was the chronic illness that weakened the patient. Earthquakes were the heavy body blows. And the Sea Peoples? They were the final fatal infection that a healthy body could have fought off, but that a sick one couldn't. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is a fascinating story, but why does a 3,200-year-old cold case really matter to us? Well, because when you hold it up and take a good look, it looks an awful lot like a mirror. This ancient collapse is a chilling warning for our own globalized world. I mean, just look at their supply chains. They were totally dependent on tin from thousands of miles away. When that supply line broke, their whole world fell apart. Does that sound familiar? Today, we have the exact same dependency on semiconductors from Taiwan or on rare earth minerals from just a handful of countries. Their tin crisis is our microchip shortage. And what about the Sea Peoples? We call them invaders, but what were they, really? They were the world's first climate refugees, fleeing a homeland that could no longer feed them. Today, we are staring down the barrel of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people being displaced by our own changing climate. The parallel is just impossible to ignore. Which brings us all the way back to that scribe in Ugarit. He didn't know he was writing the obituary for an entire age. He just knew his world was ending, and he was trying to save one last message. The collapse of 1177 BC is the ultimate lesson that being complex doesn't mean you're resilient. In fact, it can make you incredibly fragile. And so the real question is, for us, when our own interconnected systems start to shake, will we be any more prepared than they were?